Concussions are the sword of Damocles hanging over the head of mixed martial arts. It prevents more widespread acceptance, draws endless criticism from advocacy groups, shortens careers, and leaves our favorite fighters as tragic husks of what they once were. The question is, how do we reduce concussions while keeping MMA fights entertaining? That sounds like a really tough question, but it's not. It has a really easy answer. Take away the gloves. I get that this might be a weird thing for people to wrap their brains around, so I want to go over the physics of fighting and explain why there is absolutely no other answer. First, understand that most cumulative brain trauma actually results from training. We can change the rules of the sport, but if fighters then go home and hit themselves with hammers, then there's not a lot we can do about it. But what we can do is address how regulatory bodies can at least affect what happens during official matches. And a top-down change to sanctioned bouts might also hasten the shift in training practices to match the new rule set. Second, let's acknowledge that the kind of long-term brain injuries that we see in combat sports are caused less by big hits and more by cumulative career damage. While kicks to the head can result in great highlight reel knockouts, punches make up the vast majority of strikes thrown and are likely responsible for the majority of head trauma. Therefore, what we should really focus on is the effect of punching on the human head and how the rules and regulations of combat sports can change that dynamic. What we really want to do is reduce the force enacted on fighters' heads. Force is the rate of change of momentum. This means we can either reduce the total momentum of the system or we can reduce how quickly momentum changes. But we can actually break this down even further. Remember that momentum is simply mass times velocity, and that force is mass times acceleration. So here are the things we could theoretically do to reduce concussions. Number 1, reduce the mass of a punching arm, which is impossible unless you start hollowing out bones. Number 2, reduce the speed of the punching arm, which would have to be a conscious choice on the part of the puncher, and they have no reason to do that. Or you could put some parachutes on their arm, but that's even less practical. Number 3, reduce the rate of change in momentum by increasing the time it takes to accelerate, which might be possible. Number 4, increase the mass of fighters' heads, which also might be possible. So let's explore some of these possibilities. The good news is that poofy gloves can help slow the acceleration of your head when being punched by having the padding absorb some of the energy, thereby lessening the force. The bad news is that that takes way too much padding to be practical. Boxing gloves are already insanely poofy for MMA, and boxing still has a massive concussion problem. Boxing gloves already quadruple the volume of my hand. Making them even larger would be ludicrous. Getting anything nearly that poofy in a sport where you have to grapple would be completely impractical. While the much smaller gloves used in MMA would technically reduce the acceleration on your head, the gloves have to be able to compress to have an effect. There is going to be a direct correlation between the size of the gloves and the effect on acceleration. And the thin gloves used in MMA would have a negligible effect. Plus, the larger we make the gloves, the more mass we're adding to the puncher's arm, which could make the total momentum even greater. So, while reducing the force with gloves isn't impossible, it is completely impractical. The gloves would have to utterly dwarf boxing gloves. And when the gloves are too fluffy to knock someone out and too bulky to grapple, how do you even win the fight? Now, you may ask, well, what if we put padding on fighters' heads instead? In theory, that would both reduce cranial acceleration and increase the mass of their heads, which is one of the few ways we could also reduce final cranial velocity. However, there's a different aspect of physics at play here that ruins it. Remember that this headgear would have to be very large to have an effect, and the extra volume makes the head an easier target and effectively becomes a lever that makes your opponent's head easier to turn. This can actually increase the leverage of a punch, making concussions even worse. We have years of research showing that existing headgear used by amateur boxers actually increases the risk of concussions due at least partially to an increase in rotational acceleration. Now, maybe you could rig up some sort of helmet that turns freely on the head, thereby reducing linear forces without acting as a lever, but now you've introduced a massive piece of equipment with multiple shells and a mechanism inside that is going to result in your eyes being covered after every hit. You passed the limit of practicality a while ago. Oh, and for those of you that think I just came up with a brilliant idea for a football helmet, I read about that product a decade ago.
And the external shell, when it's hit, it moves. And the struts, which are attached, absorb force and diminish force.
Essentially, there's no good way for any kind of equipment to reduce brain damage, at least not while maintaining fighters' ability to actually fight. Does this mean that it's hopeless? That there's absolutely no way to reduce the brain damage inflicted on fighters? No! Reducing concussions is actually really simple. It just can't be done by adding equipment. Instead, we have to take equipment away. Remember that the current gloves and wraps are having an effect on the damage taken because they're spreading out the kinetic energy. Their limited ability to compress might not have much of an effect on momentum, but the way gloves spread out force has an enormous effect on pressure, which is what's responsible for tissue damage. Even thin gloves significantly reduce bumps, bruises, cuts, and fractures. Good thing we have gloves, right? Wrong! First of all, your job as a fighter is to hurt your opponent. If you're unable to bruise, cut, or fracture them, then the only thing you can do is concuss them. Your fists don't have any other way to hurt them. Second of all, gloves also protect your fists from cuts, bruises, and fractures. And since your fist can't be concussed, that means you're free to punch as hard as you want. Fighters being free to wing punches at full force is why we're seeing such high momentum strikes causing long-term brain damage. If you take away the gloves, fighters might be forced to rein in their punches for fear of damaging their hands. This means they will have to punch with a lower speed, thereby lowering momentum, thereby lowering the force exerted on the head, thereby lowering the severity of concussions. In addition, the increased frequency of tissue damage can result in more stoppages due to blood, fractures, and significant swelling. An increased number of stoppages means fights can end before someone gets badly concussed. One of the main factors driving long-term brain trauma is repeated impacts. Even the punches that don't knock you out or obviously concuss you still add up to a lot of damage over time. Being knocked out after one punch is actually a lot safer than being knocked out after 100 punches, meaning that all that padding we were using to prevent injuries was probably just making brain trauma worse. Allowing fights to end sooner due to soft tissue or bone damage will allow fighters to avoid a lot of these smaller shots that add up over time. And it will also allow them to avoid massive knockouts that would have ended up happening if the fight was allowed to continue. And yeah, getting your face mangled by someone's knuckles isn't ideal, but it's a fight. And it's certainly better than what we have. Skin and bones heal. Your brain doesn't. I'd much rather have a somewhat temporary injury that affects my face than a permanent injury that affects my brain. And unless you're an exceptionally beautiful idiot, you probably agree. Now, all of this is nice in theory, but is there a way to verify that less padding is actually safer? Well, one study looked at the commonly agreed upon concussion rates for boxing and MMA and found that the rate for boxing is 14.7%, while the rate for MMA is somewhere between 6% and 12%, meaning that concussions go down as padding is reduced. Now, obviously this comparison has a lot of lurking variables. After all, what if the rules of boxing actually make concussions more likely? Well, the same study also examined the concussion rate of bare knuckle boxing and found it to be 3.2%. And bare knuckle boxers still wear hand wraps, so that reduction could get even larger. Simply taking away the gloves reduced the concussion rate of boxing by over 78%. That's huge! More than 3/4 of concussions just stopped happening. Think of how many lives that would save. How many fighters would avoid perpetual misery in their old age. Think about how removing the gloves is the most obvious and objectively moral thing we could possibly do, and it's still not going to happen. Politicians and regulators aren't incentivized to do their job well. They're incentivized to make it look like they're doing their job well. And to the average voter, taking away the gloves just looks dangerous. Black eyes and lacerations are ugly. But concussions are invisible, and telling uneducated voters that the long-term effects of CTE actually means that mangling people's faces is a good idea makes it rather hard to win an election. So, that's the reality we live in. We know how to reduce concussions. We've proven it mathematically, and we've shown it in the research. We can save lives and make MMA more exciting and street applicable all at the same time, and nobody's doing it. Write to your congressman or something, because we have to get this changed.